All right, AMP1 students. In this video, we are going to start talking about nerves and what is a nerve and what it's composed of. So remember, the nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. So they're located in the periphery of the body. And you can visibly see nerves. They are large enough that we can see them without a microscope. And when you're in lab, if you go up and look at the plastinate man, you can visibly see quite a few of his nerves running throughout his body. But what we want you to know is what those nerves are composed of, and what the nerve contains are mainly the axons of many neurons, like thousands of neurons. So it's the nerve is actually like a bundle of axons that are all kind of going to the same region of the body. So they're all traveling in the same structure, which is a nerve. You will also talk about the connective tissue layers that surround the nerve, but we talk about that in lab, so I don't have you talk about those in the lecture part here. So, all right, so that's what a nerve is. And then we also will, depending on what nerve we're talking about in the body, we can describe it. So a lot of times you'll hear me talk about the nerves that come or that are originating from the brain. So we'll call those cranial nerves. And you'll learn a little bit later when we get to the chapter 13 about the brain, more details about all the cranial nerves and what their functions are. And then we also have, and there's 12 pairs of those cranial nerves, so that's how many cranial nerves that we have. And then we also have the spinal nerves, the nerves that originate from the spinal cord, and there's actually 31 pairs of those. And so those, again, we'll talk a little bit more detail about when we get to chapter 14, which talks about spinal cord and the spinal nerves. All right, so that's one way we can classify them based on, whether they're associated with the brain or with the spinal cord. Now, also, if we are to look at those nerves and look at those axons of the neurons running through them, there's some nerves that just have sensory neurons. So just have the sensory neurons in them that are taking the signals to the CNS. So we have some nerves that are like that. We also have some nerves that just have the axons of motor neurons. So they're the nerves that just have signals going through them where the signal goes away from the central nervous system. But the primary type of nerves that we have in the body are called mixed nerves because they contain both sensory neurons, the axons of sensory neurons, and the axons of motor neurons. So that's primarily the ones that we learn about in our lab. So the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, the kind of the main nerves of the body are mixed nerves. They contain both sensory and motor neurons, or the axons of those. All right, so that is what you should know about the nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Now, when it comes to the other part or structure that you can find in the peripheral nervous system, it's called ganglia, so that's plural, and then ganglion is singular. So nerves are generally it's a bundle of axons and it's pretty narrow. But the other part of a neuron is more wide. It has it's called the cell body, and it has the nucleus in it. And so what these neurons will do is when they're running through the peripheral nervous system, the axons usually run together as a bundle called a nerve. And then the cell bodies usually cluster together in the same area as well. And so when you see like a kind of a bulge or a swelling, enlarged area along the length of a nerve, that's usually where there's a cluster of the cell bodies of a lot of different neurons. So when we see that, the name we give to that structure is called a ganglion. And so you guys will learn about, you'll identify certain ganglions. So like in lab 9, you guys will need to be able to identify on our spinal cord models the dorsal root ganglion, or you can call it posterior root ganglion. And the other ganglion that we'll talk about is associated with the autonomic motor neurons. So they have ganglion as well, called parasympathetic and sympathetic. So when we get to that chapter, which is 15, we'll talk about ganglion at that point too. So those are our nerves and our ganglion that you should be familiar with when it comes to the anatomy of our nervous system. Now we're going to start talking about the specific cells that are part of the nervous system and part of the nervous tissue. So we have 2 distinct cell types. So we have the neurons. So those are sometimes they'll call them the functional cells of the nervous system, because they're really the ones that are sending a nerve impulse or an action potential from one area of the body to the other. So they're primarily the ones responsible for communication and control. But we also have another group of cells that are smaller than neurons, and they're there mainly to support the neurons, protect the neurons, but they don't do any of the sending nerve impulses or action potentials. So they don't do any of the communications. So we're going to talk about, first we'll talk about the neurons and the basic anatomy of a neuron, which you get in lab too, but we'll talk a little bit about it in lecture. And then we'll talk about the other type of cells that support and protect neurons. They're called, as a whole, they're called glial cells, G-L-I-A-L. So we'll talk about them too. Okay, the next thing that we want to understand is just the basics of a neuron before we get into the anatomy. And we've already talked about a motor neuron when we talked about skeletal muscle contraction in chapter 10. So hopefully a lot of this will be things that you're already familiar with. So the first characteristic of a neuron is that it's excitable, which just means that it can respond to some sort of stimulus, which remember means like a change in the environment. So it gives you a couple of examples there, like stretching, a pressure change, some sort of chemical. It is able to respond to that particular stimulus. And we'll talk more about how it responds a little bit later when we get to the physiology part. So it's excitable. It's also conductive, which that means that once it is stimulated, like a stimulus, it responds to a stimulus, it can take a signal from one end of the neuron. Usually it will start at the dendrites or cell body, and then conduct it or transfer it down the length of that neuron. So it's able to conduct, and it's an electrical event, so it's able to conduct that along the length of the neuron. So that's the conductive part of our characteristics. And then the third one is secretion, and we saw this when we talked about skeletal muscle contraction and what needs to happen for skeletal muscle contraction to occur. And one of it was we needed a motor neuron to stimulate a skeletal muscle cell. So that's what neurons do. They secrete a neurotransmitter from their axon terminals or synaptic bulbs. So they're secreting that. And that will, be released and then bind to another cell, whether it's a neuron or a muscle cell, to stimulate that other cell. All right, and then the last two, again, you're probably familiar with neurons. Some of our cells are able to undergo mitosis really frequently. So like our skin, when we did the integumentary system, we talked about how like our skin cells stay in our epidermis for like a month and then they slough off and then we have to make new ones. So it's pretty rapid mitotic division going on there. So those cells don't live very long. When it comes to neurons though, pretty much what you're born with is what you end up with. So you want to be very kind to your neurons. So most neurons are formed during fetal development. So we're still in the uterus. And then they're the same ones that should be functioning when we're elderly. So they have extreme longevity. So like I said, some cells, maybe last a month, like red blood cells last 3 to 4 months. There's some bone cells that, probably last quite a bit, longer years, 10 years or something. But when it comes to neurons, they pretty much last as long as you do. So very, very long lifespan for them compared to the other cells of the body. And then the last characteristic that you should know is they're amitotic, which makes sense. So that's why we want to take care of them, because if we lose neurons, they don't have the ability to undergo mitosis, at least not to the point where, we could, have more neurons being formed. So we call them amitotic, which just means whenever you have an A in front of a word, it just means the absence of mitosis. So pretty much, there's some exceptions, small exceptions, but pretty much your neurons do not undergo mitosis and produce more neurons. So be kind to your neurons. All right, so those were our neurons. And so I think I'm going to stop this. That way we can talk about the anatomy of a neuron in the next video. And that should kind of overlap with what you're learning about the neuron and its anatomy in lab too. But I'll show you the pictures that we're going to use in lecture. So I'll see you in the next video.